I'm Marshall Kozloff.
And I'm Mike Duran.
Welcome back to Counterbalance.
Marshall couldn't join me for this introduction of our podcast with Wang Xiyue, the Princeton University graduate student who was taken hostage by the Iranians and held for about 40 months in Evin prison, the notorious Evin prison. We had a great conversation with Wang Xiyue. This is actually personally for me, my second conversation with him. I had him on a Hudson panel a few weeks ago. Wang Xiyue was born in China and immigrated to the United States when he was about 20, became a naturalized American, and has only an American passport. And in 2016, when he was in Iran doing research for his doctoral thesis at Princeton University, they arrested him and forced him to confess to being a spy, when of course he wasn't that. And they explained to him he was basically a hostage, that they had taken him prisoner because he was an American, and they were holding him until they could use him as a bargaining chip to get real Iranian spies out of American jail. What I found most interesting about that story was the intellectual change that he went through. Started out as a sort of, I don't think he would be offended if I said a rather typical graduate student who believed all of the progressive dogmas about Iran and about the need to, about the Islamic Republic and the need to engage the regime. And then after he had some direct experience with the regime, as he calls it, compulsory field work in Evin prison, he had a complete about face in his worldview. And he's a extremely thoughtful, experienced, and intelligent observer of Iran and China too, being Chinese. Before we get into the episode, if you want to know more about Wang Xiyue, about his views on Iran and China, go to Hudson.org and check out the panel we did with him, which is called Taking Stock of China's Emerging Middle Eastern Kingdom. Without any more introduction, let's dive into the episode. Wang Xiyue, thank you so much for being here. Before I ask you a question, let me just tell everyone, all of our listeners, that you told me that in China your name is Wang Xiyue, and that's how people address you. So that's what I'm calling you. But everyone else calls you Xiyue or Wang, or I don't know. So we're going to go Wang Xiyue here. You were in prison in Iran, in Evin prison, the infamous place, for 40 months. I wonder if we could just start by asking you how you kept your sanity during that time. There must have been nights when you thought you weren't going to get out of there.
First of all, thank you very much, Michael, for having me in this podcast. It's really my pleasure and privilege to be here. So yes, I spent 40 months in the Evin prison, and then it was a very harrowing experience. But the fact that I was arrested as a hostage, a point that early on the Iranian intelligence made it very clear to me, gave me hope that I might be released anytime. Maybe today, maybe 9.5 years from now. So that was important for me to keep my sanity, knowing that I most probably won't spend 10 years in prison. On the other hand, I received tremendous support from my family. My wife was a phenomenal advocate on my behalf, and then she was working full-time while taking care of my son and running a campaign to get me out of Iran. And I'm eternally grateful to her and the support from other members of my family. On top of that, I had a very dedicated cohort of graduate students from Princeton who really supported me emotionally, also supported my family. And then they were running a very effective campaign with my wife to rally for my freedom. So these factors are all very important. But equally important, I think, is the fact that the United States government, in my opinion, take it seriously for Americans being jailed abroad, especially the previous administration. When Secretary Pompeo read my name in TV, which was actually broadcasted live in Iranian TV, I felt very, very uplifting. Contrary to what the Iranians have told me, you're forgotten, you're rot in prison, I understood that at the very top of our government, they're working for my release, and I wasn't forgotten.
How did you know that Mike Pompeo had said your name? Did you have access to media there, and how did you know that the graduate students and your family were working on your behalf?
Well, I was allowed to call, so I was in regular contact with my family, and then I also could contact my lawyer in America. So I had access to information, what's going on outside. That's one aspect. But on the other hand, every major announcement with regard to Iran coming from Washington is broadcasted live in English in the Iranian press TV, which is English channel, but also dubbed into Persian at the same time in the Persian language channels. So every time when there was a important announcement made by the administration, we would watch it on the TV in prison. And then I actually saw multiple announcements and speeches given by President Trump and then Secretary Pompeo. So I knew that the American hostage is on the top of the government's agenda. And the fact that in multiple occasions the administration mentioned my name, and the fact that I was imprisoned and this issue need to be dealt with was very encouraging to me and gave me a tremendous hope.
Let's set the stage a little bit. So you're obviously still in academia. You're at Princeton. Two questions here. One, what was the research? What was the topic of the research you were engaged in back then? And then two, how are you really moving forward and considering your pursuits in academia?
Well, when I went to Iran, I was actually looking for a research topic, and I found one reading through the documents and the document descriptions in the Iranian archives. So I was working on a comparative governance project on how the Iranian and Russian states in the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century managed frontier Turkmens between Russia and Iran. Very few works have been done on the local governance in Iran. And then that was also right after JCPOA came into effect. And it was a time where most people were very optimistic about a rapprochement between the United States and Iran. So I went there to do this kind of research at advice of my professors at Princeton. And then unfortunately today, the research, however interesting it was, is no longer possible because I don't have access to Iranian archive anymore. And apparently due to COVID, international travel, archival research becomes a really big challenge. And then now, having come back from Iran, due to my extraordinary experience, I'd say, I'm reorienting my subject of research more towards a contemporary period. I'm looking at China and Russia's interaction with Iran in their regional strategy since the 1970s.
You also did field work on totalitarian state in Iran. You could work on that as well.
Well, yes. My advisor at Princeton is a leading expert on authoritarian regimes and then the history of Russia and Soviet Union. So I learned a lot in theory how authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes work. And then my experience in Iran was really a field work to actually experience that firsthand. But I do think what I have learned in classroom helped me to understand what was going on in Iran.
Let's focus here. It would be great for you to give some context on the relationships between the authoritarian regimes in that part of the Middle East. So, for example, Mike, you were recently on a panel together focusing on this topic. So it'd be great to talk about those themes and focus in on moving forward, how Russia, China, Iran are really working together or how they aren't working together in the region.
Well, this is a very big question. China and Iran signed the deal, a strategic partnership deal in March. Actually, it's really interesting when you look at the deal. The deal was first broached in 2016 when Xi Jinping visited Iran, but it failed to materialize during the JCPOA, when JCPOA was still in place. And then by 2018, the deal no longer made sense for China when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed the sanctions. And it only resurfaced in 2020, mid-2020, where if you look into the reactions to the leak of the news about the deal, you realize that there are a lot of arguments and debate in the West about the impact of the deal, but the Chinese government basically kept silent, and then the foreign ministry dodged questions about the deal when the foreign reporters asked.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Just to add a little context to what you're saying, it was the information about the deal came from the Iranian side,
yes,
to the New York Times, and with no confirmation from the Chinese side, suggesting that the Iranians were trying to put some pressure on the Chinese or use the draft deal in some way in bargaining with the West. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I personally believe that's more of a public relation gambit on the part of the Iranians to indicate Trump's maximum pressure campaign has failed. And of course, there's no shortage of receptive proponents of engagement and the JCPOA who would take that kind of argument readily. And indeed, New York Times and other outlets commented towards that direction. China and Iran are getting closer, and then we need to get back to JCPOA. Otherwise, they will form an anti-US alliance, which is bad for us. So the whole idea is, the Iran-China deal was made a kind of leverage, if you will, for discrediting Trump and push for a return to JCPOA at that time. But interestingly, China kept silent, and China didn't sign the deal when Trump was in place. When Trump was still the president, and incidentally, if you look at the trajectory of China-Iran trade from November when Biden was elected, the Chinese illicit purchase of Iranian oil skyrocketed. Because I think the message that the Biden administration conveyed to the public was very clear. We're going to re-engage Iran. We're going to re-enter the JCPOA. So that seems to suggest to the Chinese, you can go ahead and do business with Iran. And then again, the deal wasn't signed by China under maximum pressure, but it was signed by China when the Biden administration repeatedly signaled that the United States would return to the deal sooner than later, and we're ready to make a series of concessions even without Iran reciprocating the U.S. gesture. for loosening up pressure on Iran. This signals acquiesced China to go ahead with the deal. But if you look at the deal itself, at this moment, probably it lacked the kind of substance mentioned in the June 2020 draft agreement, as the Chinese Foreign Ministry have explained. And I think we have a reason to believe that because the deal wasn't signed at the very high, very top level, but head of state, and then there was no news press conference. There was, and then the Chinese and Iranian foreign ministers did not give interviews about the deal. There was no concrete bilateral deals signed as a result of this larger partnership deal. In contrast to a major joint venture signed with the UAE during the same trip to the Middle East made by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And then there was also a high-profile interview done by Wang Yi with the Al Arabiya, major outlet in Saudi Arabia. So and I also need to say that Iran wanted to buy Chinese COVID vaccines, but the Chinese pharmaceutical company that makes these vaccines was reluctant to cooperate with Iran to sell Iran the vaccines in fear of U.S. sanction. So I think that says quite much about to what extent, at this moment at least, the deal really contains.
Let me repeat back to you what I heard, because I wasn't 100% sure I understood what you were saying at the end. The deal starts in 2016 under, it's first negotiated in 2016, but not finalized. Right after the JCPOA and under the Obama administration. And then it is re-announced by the Iranian side only under the Trump administration.
Yes.
And so when it's, but still not finalized. And so it's re-announced under the Trump administration as part of a propaganda campaign to say to the American people, in the context of the election, that Trump is pushing Iran into the arms of the Chinese.
Yes.
But then what happens is it only actually gets signed by the Chinese after Biden comes in.
Yes.
So the original negotiation of the deal and the signing of it take place under Obama and Biden, when the United States is being flexible or is being engaging in outreach to the Islamic Republic.
Yes, I think, yes. Yeah.
Okay, but what I didn't, and then the last bit I didn't understand, and if I heard you correctly, what you were saying is that although the deal has now been finalized, a lot of it just remains on paper. And there isn't a lot of, other than the massive oil sales, which have skyrocketed, there isn't a lot of real substance behind the military and intelligence cooperation and other things that we have heard about, including Chinese investment into oil fields and gas fields in Iran. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. Because I think there's a tendency to exaggerate China's relationship with Iran. Because if you look at Iran, it's a country that is not very stable. The political risk in Iran for investors doesn't really matter you're Chinese or you're European or you're Japanese. The political risk for doing business and investment in Iran is very, very high. There are many domestic reasons, but also the most important reason is the possible fluctuation of U.S. policy towards Iran. Every 4 years, you have a presidential election, and there are uncertainties what the American administration will do. So that's a big reason for foreign investment to reckon with when it comes down to a serious large project in Iran. So I think that is correct, because without very clear indication of a stable trajectory of U.S.-Iran relations. The way how U.S.-Iran relation would unfold in the coming years. I think large international business, including Chinese, would be hesitant to commit to large investment and projects.
It would be great just to hear, especially from an audience perspective, given the conversation around a presumptive withdrawal from Afghanistan, the discussion about the U.S.'s role in the Middle East, what do you think the stakes are for the U.S. when it comes to the relationship with Iran and their broader plans for regional hegemony?
Okay, so I'm talking from a standpoint of U.S. national and security interest, right? I think the Biden administration and Biden's strategists believe that by engaging Iran, by realigning U.S. National interest, U.S. security interest in the region with Iran, by distancing traditional U.S. allies as Saudi Arabia and Israel, we'll be able to induce a balance of power in the region, so that we can get out and then geostrategically refocus managing China's expansion. The war in Afghanistan and the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is to a large extent the same type of calculation. We have stayed there for 20 years. We're not defeating the Taliban. So what's the point? It's not our territory, and then we have spent trillions of dollars. Why do we want to do that? Let's get out and focus on something that is more pressing. But I think this is a misunderstanding or a faulty calculation. My favorite analogy would be Islamic Republic of Iran and then powers like Taliban or ISIS. They are not constructive powers, right? So they're destructive and spoiler powers, meaning they have the ability to create a big trouble. Yes, they do not generate wealth the way that our major competitors, say China, does. But they need to be contained. They need to be dealt with. You can't just retreat and let them do whatever they want. And I say this analogy. Let's say I often tell people, look, it costs you $1 million maybe to build a nice house, but it doesn't cost the arsonist too much money to burn it down. And then Iran and the Islamist oppositions in Afghanistan are kind of that arsonist. They have an immense power to create trouble for you. And then that has to be dealt with. That requires a strong U.S. presence in the region. That does not necessarily translate to material or financial gain for the U.S. Quite on the contrary, we see a tremendous amount of money that we have to spend in this for this purpose. But the flip side of the problem is that if we retreat, if we do not spend time and resources to contain this kind of threat, they can cause more damage than we would like to bear. For example, I remember during the first Gulf War that Iraqis were shooting the Scud missiles to Kuwait. And then the Americans were sending the Patriot missiles to intercept the Scuds. And then I remember as a schoolboy, I used to ask my father, what the news are saying the Patriot missiles cost several times more than the Scud missiles. So why Americans are spending so much more money to shoot down the missile that costs much less? And then my father said, because if the Scud missile hits its target, it causes more damage. So it's important that you spend even a lot of money, more money than the Scud missile to intercept it. And I think the logic for the U.S. to maintain its presence, to contain powers like Iran and the Taliban in the region is similar, because if we don't, they're going to expand. they will view our retreat as our weakness, and they're going to exploit it. And then it would be too late when we realize that a retreat wouldn't work, and then we have to spend even more money and time to push them back if we decide to withdraw now.
I couldn't agree with you more about that point, about them being destructive powers. I always think of them as mafia, because it's basically a protection racket. You know, either you pay us, or we're gonna torch your shop. Everything they do, including the nuclear program, is an extortion scheme.
Yes.
In one, the terrorism is an extortion scheme. The nuclear program, their militias, all of it. I've read a couple of interviews with you. I've spoken to you before, and you're very clear on the point that you didn't always understand that this was the essence of the regime, the very soul of the regime. In one interview, you seemed to suggest that you came to that realization when they arrested you, basically took you hostage, forced you to confess to being a spy, which you weren't. But you had come there to Iran with the feeling that now we're going to have the JCPOA. The Iranian regime wants to have better relations with the West, and it was a surprise to you that they would just grab you like that and use you as a hostage. Was that the moment that you started to reinterpret Iranian foreign policy, when you were personally treated this way, or was it a process?
This is really a process, because as I often mention that I said President Obama should visit Iran when they asked me about how I look at Iran-U.S. relations, and then that was taken as evidence against me in court that gave me 10 years of sentence a couple of months later, and then that was a strange thing to me, and I had to kind of bitterly laugh, right? So things like this add up, right? In the beginning, they also told me they preferred Trump to win the election in 2016, because if Trump wins, that would justify a harsher confrontational stance the regime would take against the United States. So that indicates to me that no matter what the US does, they're going to hate us, and it is to their benefit to maintain that hostility. And the big problem is that the leading media outlets here in the US tend not to say or tend not to suggest things like this. And I think also a big problem is that in the academia, where future leaders are trained, we underplay the agency of local actors in the Middle East. We overemphasize the agency of the West, of the United States, basically suggesting we've been wrong, our policy been wrong, we've been very condescending or imperialist, and if we fix our wrong, and they will come around. And I think that's fundamentally wrong, or let's say at least that's just part of the picture. And then we have a tendency to ignore the other side of the picture, which as a consequence leads to policies not based on reality on the ground, but based on our ideological understanding of the current affairs.
You must be very popular on campus these days with these views.
That's the problem. I don't think liberal progressive professors would want to engage with me. And in fact, I haven't been invited by anyone who promotes the deal for a discussion. I think there is a tendency that my views are not counted among the people who support the deal, so they don't want to talk to me.
A good way of thinking about this for everyone, what do you think the choice is? Policymakers, folks in the US and the international community, what choices or trade-offs do you think they're going to have to make in the coming months or even years?
Well, look, I really have to say up front, and I'm not against diplomacy. I'm not against negotiating with Iran, right? But I'm against negotiating from a position of weakness. I'm against negotiating without leverage. And I think the current Biden administration has a misrepresentation of what Obama legacy on Iran actually is. If you look at the Obama what Obama did in relation to Iran, whenever Obama wanted to engage Iran, his message was met with indifference or being exploited, or exploited. And so Obama engagement basically brought Iranian influence through the Quds Force directly to Syria, right? And allowed the Iranian infiltration into a good part of Afghanistan, and then emboldened Iran also in Yemen and Iraq, right? So a lot of Iraqi militia activities intensified under Obama's engagement. But none of this produced anything positive for the US interest. Basically, the engagement allowed Iran to encroach on US interest in the region. What really worked was when Obama decided that he really had to put pressure on Iran to force it to come to negotiation table and talk about issues of issues that we want to address, which he created a coalition to bring multilateral sanctions against Iran, and then eventually sanctioned the Iranian central bank. All these things turned out to be very effective, that they were able to force Iran to negotiate. But unfortunately, in my opinion, Obama was faced with the pressure of election cycle. He had to produce a deal as he thought the way it should go, and then the deal wasn't strong enough to pass a Congress vote to make a treaty, which created further problems because in rushing to the deal, he had to make major compromises. And then now the Biden administration is faced with a similar situation. I think the tendency is to go back to the original deal without strengthening it. And I think that is wrong. And I think, in fact, this time, time is on our side. The Biden administration should really use the leverage put in place by the Trump administration and continue to press Iran. You have to really know that the maximum pressure campaign has brought down the Iranian foreign exchange reserve to very, very low level. And the regime is literally on the brink of a bankruptcy in a couple of months. But yet, the Biden administration is eager to inject a large amount of money, frozen Iranian oil money, to allow that to go back to Iran and to prolong and resuscitate the regime. And I think that's think about a negotiation, right? Instead of leveraging up yourself and then decrease the possible leverage of your opponent, they are empowering the opponent and then taking leverage away, our leverage away. So I think eventually that's going to be self-defeating, but I think they're going to do it.
Can I go back to this question of how you're received on campus? As a refugee from academia myself, I find it amusing. The dilemma. What I find amusing is the dilemma that your experience poses for the progressive professors who have a set of beliefs that is really contradicted by your experience, and it's not easy for them to simply dismiss you because you went to Iran when they were saying it's totally safe to go there, no problems. Don't listen to those crazy right-wing people who say that the regime is a problem. And you went there with the same beliefs that they had about how engagement with Iran was going to work, and then you had the exact opposite experience. So they don't invite you. I understand that, but do you hear back through the grapevine what they say about you? How do they explain to themselves that you did not have the experience that they were actually predicting you would have?
Well, I think they just simply ignore me. They don't talk to me, and then
And among
that's it.
themselves, they don't even try to. So they don't even answer the question in even in an intellectually dishonest way. They just avoid.
They just avoid. And in fact, when I came back, I realized that I was removed from the mailing list of the Iranian Center.
Wow.
You were disappeared.
Yes, and then in fact, in February 11th, you know that date is the anniversary of Iranian Islamic Revolution. February 11th, 2020, the director of the Iranian Center invited Barbara Slevin and Trita Parsi to give a public lecture in Princeton in support of JCPOA. I didn't know that until one of the panelists told me, there's such an event, you should go. And I said, I wasn't invited, I wasn't invited, but he said, go and sit in the audience. And then I went. And then it was so infuriating what Barbara Slevin and Trita Parsi have said. And I had to stand up and confront them. I was very disappointed, in some of the liberal progressive professors. They don't even try, in my opinion, to form a panel with opposing views. Well, how is this going to foster academic freedom and real academic debate?
They don't want it. I had the same. Sorry to cut you off. I had the same experience. I always say about myself that I'm a guy. I was a total idiot. I actually believed for years. I believed the mission statement of academia. Companies always have their mission statement, and usually it's total BS. So if you had a company that actually believed its mission statement, you'd go home and you'd say, you know what I really like about my company? My company actually believes its mission statement. And I for some reason, I had all this evidence in front of me from the moment I went to graduate school, even before when I was an undergraduate, that academia does not believe its mission statement about wanting to foster, free debate, freedom of speech, life of the mind, reason, and so on. That they really want to indoctrinate. That's what they want to do. But it took me years. It took me years to realize that.
And I think the biggest lesson I've learned through my experience in Iran is precisely this. I think I'm really a victim of the lack of critical thinking, which should have been promoted in academia. But unfortunately, what we hear in academia today, for the most part, is one-sided, liberal progressive take of the world. I'm not saying that's wrong. I think they should have a place in political debate and academic debate. But the problem is there's a lack of the opposite argument, which is creating problems at this moment.
Here's the immediate question as we wrap. What does everything you and Mike are especially just saying mean for your future in terms of what you want to do next, in terms of how you think your experiences are going to continue to contribute to the policy space? How do you think about all of that?
Well, I think I'm okay. So this is a good question. So I came to Princeton to be trained as a serious scholar, as a historian. I aspire to be a professor, just like my advisor, and I still admire my advisor, who is a leading expert in Russian Soviet history. But I don't think given my experience, I'm convinced that I have a reasonable place purely as academic in academia, because I don't think they really appreciate what I have to say, because now I'm feeling that I'm at odds with the prevalent liberal progressive views in academia. And then, I mean, if you look around, you would understand it is difficult for anybody with a conservative view to thrive as a young scholar in today's academia. And I think that's very unfortunate. So that being said, I think with my academic training and my in-country experience, especially my compulsory fieldwork under authoritarian regime, I think I have a unique combination of knowledge and insight, and I can use towards informing better policy making. I really hope to complete my PhD at Princeton and then become more active after that in the policy field, to be able to continue to contribute to broader debate with regard to the Middle East, China's relation to the Middle East, the U.S. relation to the Middle East, U.S. relation to China. And then I want to bring nuance to the larger debate. And I hope what I have to say will be appreciated.
You know, when I went to college way before you, I started college in 1980, and the professors that I had were that an older generation that came to prominence after World War II. And there was a real appreciation in academia for nuance. And the people who taught me had lots of life experience and experience around the world, so that they understood all of the things that you're talking about with respect to Iran. And they were all liberals. I don't think I had a single professor in college that wasn't a liberal. But they weren't dogmatic ideologues who were indoctrinating people. And in my opinion, the world has really changed. And it's not just academia. The fact of the matter is, I hate to end on a real negative note. I find your aspirations laudatory. I wish you every success in bringing nuance to the world. But the fact is that we're living through an age that just does not appreciate nuance. Unfortunately, there are very, very few institutions. I think the one that we work at, and I'm not saying it because we work there, I think it's one of the few that really appreciates nuance. Most other think tanks are ideologically driven on some level. So you have it in academia, you have it in the think tank world. Very hard to find a place that really wants to understand that there's everything isn't black and white.
Oh, yes, I completely agree with you. But one has to start from somewhere. And I just really, really hope that the public and our government can hear what I have to say, because I do have some unique ideas about Iran. Just want to remind you, not a single currently active U.S. diplomat has spent time in that country or dealing with the Iranian regime from inside. So, and I really want them to understand that it is important to have a realistic understanding of the regime, and we should not be blindsided by our ideology, whatever that is. And today when we talk about liberal and conservative, there's almost a moral value attached to it. When you say liberal is positive and the conservative is negative, and I think that's also wrong. And I really wish one day that will change, because if you look at it, conservative basically means you're empirical. right? You make a judgment based on your experience. But where liberal, you're willing to venture into things that are not proven by experience. If we can oversimplify the distinction that way, I don't think there should be a moral label on that. And then the current situation, I really sincerely hope would change. That the conservative scholars and professors being given a place that they deserve in academia and in the policy world.
Really well said.
I just want to say that Wang Xiyue, I think your voice is important on so many levels, and one of them is it's not just that you're one of the very few Americans who has spent as much time in Iran talking to Iranians and seen these often unseen dimensions of Iranian life. It's also that you're able to come out of that and talk freely about it. Because there are other Americans who go to Iran, spend a lot of time in Iran, but they're Iranians, so they have family there, or they have business interests and so on. And so in order to protect their access to the regime, in order to protect their families, they have to when they come out, they have to tell lies. Even if they have been, I won't name names, but even if they have been held hostage, they come back out and they tell lies because the regime still has their hooks into them in one way or another. So your voice is incredibly important because you have had this experience and you can talk about it freely.
Yes.
Which makes you just about unique.
Well, thank you very much. I hope more people like you would be willing to listen what I have to say, and I will make every effort to deepen my knowledge on Iran and the Middle East region. It's really my wish and sincere hope to be able to continue to contribute to a better understanding and inform better policymaking with regard to Iran and the Middle East.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us. That was a very engaging conversation. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you feel obliged, rate us on Apple Podcasts, rate us 5.0. If you don't feel so obliged, rate us 5.0. And if you want to learn more, come visit us at hudson.org. See you next week.